So, as you know, we've got our friend Jeremy Fricke to present today. I'll give you a quick intro about Jeremy. So first of all, I went to high school with Jeremy. Fun fact, and found out randomly a few weeks ago that he has co-authored a chapter in this newly released book called Modeling Religious Pluralism. Um, so Jeremy is an educator on religious diversity, an independent consultant on improved intergenerational and interfaith engagement. He currently serves as executive director at Camp Naco. It's a Buffalo soldier site being rehabbed into an intercultural center. Previous to that, a lot of us are kind of in the Omaha area, so you may be familiar with the Tri-Faith Center, or the Tri-Faith Initiative. So he worked there, kind of cultivating this living laboratory of interreligious engagement. It's basically like a Christian church, a synagogue, and a mosque all on the same campus with a little center in the middle for engagement between all those faiths. So his chapter in the book is called Religion in the Workplace. And so he's going to talk a bit today about religious pluralism and just basically whatever he wants to talk about. I was going to share really quick. I was uh, perusing his chapter last night, and I wanted to share a quote that from the chapter I thought really kind of encapsulates what this group, Torn, is all about. Um, so it's on page 155 of Modeling Religious Pluralism. It says healthy and productive conflict is appreciated across religious lines of difference in nearly every scripture. Difficult conversations to seek understanding are a sign that someone cares. It's a powerful signal of trust. So I was like, oh, yeah, that's why we do Torn is we want to have the tough conversations that a lot of people avoid. So we don't all agree on everything in this group, but we care about each other. And so yeah, I'm hoping that that's the kind of group we are embodying. So really looking forward to hearing from Jeremy on his chapter and just on religious pluralism and his work engaging with people of different faiths. So I'll turn it over to Jeremy for about up to 35 minutes, and then uh, we'll chat, have open discussion, and drop questions. Feel free to send questions in the chat while he presents. All you, Jeremy.
All right, sounds good. Oh, here, one sec. Let me cheat here with the presenter view. All right, can you see my presentation still?
Yeah, sure can.
Okay. Very cool. So yeah, hopefully you're here for the right thing. As you've heard, Jeremy Fricke here. Um, I really want to get to the place where um we think about religious pluralism itself as part of conviction. I think a lot of people get a little worried about whether that's going to water their faith down or their religious engagement down, but really that the religious pluralism itself could be part of courage, humility, and love. Um, really, the um, sorry, I'm still working on coffee too. Um, if so really this practice is a way to be able to see our neighbors more clearly and by proxy see ourselves more clearly. No, so this is not an argument that all religions are equally true or anything like that. It's really just an argument that each person deserves to be understood as truthfully as possible. Um, but before I make that case, I want to tell you a little bit about why that matters to me. So, my background is in religious studies. Um, I grew up Missouri Synod Lutheran, and eventually, I think with many of us, went through a process of maybe becoming, which we'll talk about soon, but basically, seeking, trying to figure out what I was, what I will be, all of those things. Eventually that landed me in, studying religion personally, and then becoming so passionate about learning about other religions that I decided to do it professionally. Um, I had friends who were Baha'is and Muslims and Mormons and others, and it uh, it really inspired me to understand because I had come from a place where understanding was not the main priority in my youth, but I continued to work toward that. So, I also come to this as someone who is shaped by Christianity and concerned by about faithful public life. Um, and I'm not asking for anyone to care less about truth. It's really more about truth uh, in support of our neighbors, I suppose. And that distinction matters. Um, uh, it is also very possible to feel so afraid of compromise that we mistake distance for faithfulness. But distance is not the same as discernment. Sometimes discernment requires getting close enough to see clearly. So let me define pluralism. Um, but before I get to that, I worked at Tri-Faith Initiative for about 8 years. Stopped in about 2024. There was a lot of kind of, normal organizational type of issues that I wanted to shift away from. And I was ready for an executive director position. So I applied to a few, most of them associated with the humanities, maybe I applied to a few that were religion adjacent and a few that weren't, and found a lot of meaning in the Camp Naco project, which really is all about revealing the hidden stories of the borderlands, a lot about honestly quirky history and intercultural stuff. Um, but I still do quite a bit with religion on the side. As mentioned before, I have that Oxford chapter, and I've done quite a few presentations in the past, especially about intergenerational difference in religion recently. I'm gonna skip that and go to this. So really, what I want to there's really two parts to what I want to talk about today, and one is sort of what kind of brought me from a um I think I'd call it an Abrahamic perspective, um, to be more passionate about making sure that we are having effective conversations across difference. And I use Abrahamic perspective because, um, really as a personal journey, I've always connected the most with Judaism and Christianity, and don't really belong to either tradition right now. But they still guide my everyday life. The scriptures are very important to me. Um, I believe that they should be taken seriously. But I want to point out here that the Bible is not surprised by religious difference. Religion is a concept that comes after the Bible is written, but we can see some overlap with what we can learn today about religion by looking at the dynamics of different relationships in the Bible that we could call religion looking back. Many ethnic groups are understood as, if we were going to call them today, many of them are both racially and religiously different. Today we would consider it that way, but back then they kind of considered an entire community as, somewhat unified between ethnicity, race, and religion. So, but we can still look at that and see. see how the Bible treats those conversations. Abraham, he lives among people with many different religions, and sometimes it's great, sometimes it's difficult. Joseph lives in Egypt. Sometimes that's great, sometimes that's difficult. Daniel lives in Babylon, which had a significant amount of religious diversity. Paul is obviously uh, surrounded by significant religious diversity. And uh, much of the exiles, there's many exiles in the Hebrew Bible in particular, are often centered on the idea that um, we are different and there's many traditions around us and um, our religion is important, but sometimes the other people are uh, doing in some ways even more for our religion than we are. Just so you know, I could have a course on this. I'm trying to give more like an overview and a couple of sort of lessons within here. But but if you ever want to chat more deeply about this, we certainly can. Um, I think I think kind of what we see in the Bible is that God's people have always had to live, speak, pray, and act in religiously mixed worlds. And it's definitely not a modern thing. Again, we can see it in the scripture. Um, and to me, one of the most striking examples actually comes from early in Matthew. Um, the Matthew 2 gives us the Magi. The Greek word is, I think, magoi. I know how to interpret it, but not say it. Historically, that term has been established as the priestly class of Persia, and often became sort of the term for Zoroastrians because at this time, Zoroastrians were the dominant religion in Persia. Magi implies the priests of Zoroastrians. So I think it's important to note that, this is very explicit in the Bible that the Magi are associated with this other tradition. Um, Matthew, of course, doesn't give us a super clean textbook definition, but it's assumed that if you're reading it, you know what it means. Um, and really, that matters. The first people that Matthew depicts uh, praising Jesus are not part of Jesus's community. They are religious outsiders. Their interpretation of the stars and the moons begin their journey that direction. Um, and they come looking for the King of the Jews, and in some ways see that as both their king and not their king at the same time through that. Um, but really notice that the combination in the story. Their knowledge gets them moving, but Jewish scripture supplies Bethlehem as well. Um, Sorry, let's see here. I have a ton of notes. Um, they bow before and honor Jesus before Herod does. Most Christian translations describe their action as worship, and that is understandable, but really the more textually exact description is that they bow and honor Jesus. They give gifts, they receive divine guidance in a dream, they resist Herod's violent scheme, and then they return home by another road. But also notice that Matthew does not narrate much of their story as they go home. He does not narrate some kind of like formal conversion. He does not narrate abandonment of their prior religious identity or incorporation into the community. And that doesn't mean that they didn't, but I think it's important to note that the author of the Bible wasn't getting paid by the word and kept um, the stories to the point. Um, I am primarily saying that Matthew really lets religious outsiders appear as genuine responders to God, and that their existing tradition contributes to the recognition of their own religion. And I want to again reiterate that the Magi are not giving us a modern theory of pluralism. Okay, I'm not trying to say that the Bible is pluralistic in the modern sense, but I am saying that um, other religions have are often respected more than we realize in the Bible, and even as who they are. Um, I'll mention a couple more and try to keep it short in this area, and then I'll get to my actual chapter. So even in the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, so in the New Testament we have Jesus engages with a bunch of people of uh, different religious backgrounds, different religious or ethnic backgrounds. The Canaanite woman who, you know, being interpreted as Canaanite would at this time would also understand a difference in religion. It would be religion and tribal affiliation because at the you could certainly convert to what would be kind of proto-Judaism, but but it's not described in that way. She's kind of described as an outsider in more ways than one, but yet he sees that her faith in him and her faith in the holiness of the situation does not require her to be the same exact tradition as the people around him. All right. The Roman centurion who he heals they um they don't ask for any kind of shift. The Good Samaritan, who is used as an example as really a religious outsider too. Um, the Samaritans, which I don't know if you guys have talked about the Samaritans or anything like that before, but the Samaritans were kind of seen as like the really um the really morally corrupt little brother of the Jewish community at this time. They share a lot in common, but they also they have some severe differences at this time, and one of the big ones is where the temple is, which is one of the biggest kind of things that that when people argue about where the head of the church is or something like that, those tend to be the conversations that get people really violent. But Jesus uses this other religious group, this religious group that he he does not necessarily explicitly identify with, that the people he's talking to don't explicitly identify with. He uses the Good Samaritan as an example of what it is to be good. And that doesn't, again, this isn't modern pluralism, but 2000 years ago, this is way ahead of its time. And then I have a feeling that we'll want a Q&A about this one, but maybe all of them. But the Abraham also has an engagement with Melchizedek, and the um, the origin of Melchizedek is my king is Zedek. Zedek was the name of a deity at this time also. And the Bible is very specific about um how it's described. So Abraham basically gives him alms for El Elyon. El Elyon is both the name of another god, but at a certain point in kind of Hebrew Bible history, the the names of certain deities that were especially respected by other communities were often adopted as names for, what would be understood as like Yahweh, right? So El Elyon is God, it kind of translates to God Most High, but it originates actually with a community outside of the kind of Hebrew trajectory. All right, let's see here. I'm gonna skip this one too. All right, so um, going to the chapter. So a lot of the chapter that so I wrote most of this chapter and really kind of developed a few simple models. They're not the most like heady or super academic or anything. They were intended to be practical. I developed these kind of for the workplace, but they're not exclusive to the workplace. The About the workplace, you have to make sure that you are able to talk about these things in ways that relate to people of any background related to religion. So whether someone is atheist or agnostic, whether they're Hindu or Christian or Muslim or anything in between or outside of that, the frameworks that we talk about religion really should include them in the workplace. Because, I'm not unless you're working at a church or something like that, of course. But if it's a secular place, it is adopted better if everyone kind of identifies it with in some regard. Um, I don't know if you guys have ever talked about something like, how do we define religion or anything like that, which is, of course, a rabbit hole that never ends. Um, but often that's the first question you get in these kinds of spaces like the workplace and secular spaces. So over time, I developed the 5B framework as a way to basically define religion without defining religion. Really, the goal here is rather than focusing so much on what constitutes a religion, let's look at how someone could be a type of religious, right? So the three B's are pretty well established. Belief, behavior, and belonging have been around for a little while, but belief is probably what most of the people in this room probably think of the most, and that's partially because belief tends to be the most associated with, especially Christianity, because faith kind of fits in belief, right? Like the having the proper understanding of something, having the truth of something, kind of fits in belief. But this isn't really the only way people are religious. And even folks who prioritize belief, like to be honest, I do too, pretty naturally. Um, we can actually find a lot more depth both in ourselves and in others by expanding that. So we also have behavior, which tends to be the rituals and the actions that we take, inspired um, by our religious adjacent backgrounds. Belonging, who is really about what are the communities we identify with, um, and becoming and body are the two that I added, and this is in part because through a lot of conversations with people from different religious backgrounds, these two felt underrepresented after those conversations. So becoming is really about the process, right? So belief, behavior, and belonging feel kind of static. Um, Becoming allows us to talk about how we have changed over time, how we may be changing right now. It includes things like, seeking or converting or deconverting or whatever, right? It's this there's something unique also about being religious and religion that allows us to change within that category, right? Um, and it could be small things, it could be huge things. They don't all have to be massive, testimonies or anything. It could just be like, I realized that something else seemed true. Like maybe now I do care more about um eating ethically than I ever did before, right? Like um because my belief has changed, my behavior is changing, so it's kind of part of becoming too. And then body, and there's really two main ways that this works with people. One is how people interpret you. Um, you know, it doesn't really matter what you look like. People make some assumptions about you, and it does change your relationship to your religion, right? So, I know most, or maybe all, most of the people in this room are white dudes, and that's cool. But no one's ever going to interpret you as Hindu, even though some of you might be. I don't know. Um, this kind of walking through life, and people make assumptions, correct or incorrect, and that's not a bad thing. It's just how it is. You know, um I tend to be very ethnically ambiguous to a lot of people, um for better and worse. I've been harassed by some street preachers without even knowing who I am. And I've also been accepted into many communities that I wasn't a part of. They just assumed that I was part of their community. There's some benefits and drawbacks to all that. And then the other piece, though, is like how your body interacts with the religion that you're a part of. So, I use one of the most common examples I use is um, I have a friend who's been pretty overweight most of his life, and he belonged to the Catholic Church. And although no one was mean about it, um, he did not, when he was a kid, he did not fit into the robes to, light the candles. Like the name's escaping me for that, but you know the um, the altar boy stuff, he didn't fit into that. And how does that affect how you relate to your religion if you literally physically don't don't fit in the religious space that you're in, right? Um,
Just a friendly guidepost, Jeremy. Still have
yeah.
about 10 minutes left.
Okay. I should be good. Um, so the other thing that my there's a couple of things that my chapter talks about. One also is that we should move beyond welcoming into belonging. So really, this is about, well, so I drive by a lot of churches that say all are welcome. And I also notice that some of those churches are doing well, but many of those churches don't seem to be having many new people walking in their doors. Um, it seems a little, it's well intentioned. There's nothing wrong with being welcoming, but often um, we have to ask, really like what actually makes people feel like they belong. You know, I think of, again, just a random example. Um, so a lot of the time, churches are struggling with youth, young adults especially, and yet they are doing the exact same things they've been doing for 20 years and expect to just say, please join us, and that's enough. Um, how do you make sure that you're looking and seeing, well, you know, are there ways that this space can actually truly um, help people belong who haven't belonged before? Um, I even just I think many of us have probably had this experience too. So I have a 3-year-old, and man, if I happen to be, the sole caretaker that day or something like that, and um we go to the bathroom and there's there's no way for my kid to sit on that damn seat without falling in, or me like holding him over and he's freaking out and everything's loud and he can't reach the sink to wash his hands. I can lift him up, but it makes him uncomfortable to be, held over the sink and things like that. Like these are just little things. Um, but they're they kind of tie back to the conversation about pluralism, because part of what we really need to do is look at ourselves and our own communities to see how they are already, the people within our communities already have needs that can be addressed to help people feel like they belong more. Um, let's see. We already talked about that. So again, like I worked at an interfaith organization, but we did stuff everywhere, right? We worked with different religious institutions, we worked with workplaces, schools, hospitals, um, and really this attitude about a pluralistic society allows us to think about how to have better connections. I mean, this is a time where we are more politically divided at least, and probably socially divided than we've been maybe ever. Um, and division and difference are not the same thing. Um, and that's really what I'm trying to get at here. So, what does this actually ask of us? What does pluralism ask of us? What does some of this ask for us? The first is really that we need to do our best to tell the truth about ourselves and the other. So, what I mean by that is um, we often will look at ourselves and not really allow ourselves to not fit. So reminds me of sometimes, especially like when I was working with Muslim communities, often I would sort of see that there were folks who um would say, this is sort of what I believe about sexuality or something like that. Because it fits sort of what the majority of, well, what the imam says. But in practice, the most of the people in the community, have a little more range. It's not like everyone has the exact same attitude. And that's true in any community. But and then also just as we're being honest about ourselves, we have to be honest about um, the other too, So often we like to talk about our own complexity, but kind of oversimplify others. Um, this is related to questioning religious stereotypes. There's a reason why stereotypes exist, but because there are people who fit in those stereotypes, but that doesn't mean that the entire community is that way. I also think we need to be brave enough to be the guest. So when we're talking about welcoming and belonging, welcoming is asking someone to be your guest. And guest, that's all positive. But it does create a power dynamic if you're trying to develop a community that the host holds quite a bit of power in the situation. How do we make sure that um we take turns, or we practice being a guest so we know what it's like, right? Um, that's one of the things that I found so important in interfaith work. There were so many well-meaning people who really wanted to get along and learn about each other, but they were scared. They were scared to go into each other's spaces, and a lot of that had to do with being worried about offending more than anything. It's like I don't want to do it wrong, so I'm not gonna take the risk. But we really have to take that risk and be willing to navigate being a little bit outsider to be able to understand. Um, this is my last slide, or yeah, I got one more slide, but um, oops. Well, whatever, I'll just close it. So the um we need to allow people to make sure that they're able to speak their own story about how they are becoming. This is especially true in interreligious spaces. A lot of the time it starts to feel like your responsibility is to protect, defend, and represent the tradition that you are a part of. And that gets applied to everyone in the group. And those who are changing, often need a little bit of space for being in between. Often where like people are switching overnight, but that's just not how it works usually. Um, and then really, sorry, one sec here. Um, you do not have to believe that every religion is equally true, to believe that every person deserves to be understood truthfully. Um, we I think sometimes we work too hard on defending first and understanding second. Um, Understanding does not mean adopting. It does not mean, um, having to water anything down. In fact, usually over time that helps us to understand truth better. But this was my impromptu presentation here. Um, Happy to defer now.
Before I stop recording, last presentation, I rudely stopped recording before I said thank you. So I want to get it recorded. Thank you, Jeremy. We greatly appreciate your time and effort in talking to us. So we will open it up here in just a moment. Let me hit the stop button.